Hello. How you doing? It's kind of amazing. You got a bag of seeds. There have been instances where seeds have been found in tombs, in burial locations for thousands of years. Sit there completely lifeless, and all you have to do is add water. Isn't that amazing? Two things making something new, together by themselves, they're fascinating in their own certain way, kind of like spirit and matter. Together, you have life. Yeah. Consubstantiality, which is just a fancy word of implication that you take two things, you put them together, you got something amazing. Kind of like eggs are okay, and flour is okay, and sugar is okay. You put it all together, you make a cake, and everybody's fascinated. Don't take me wrong, I don't really eat cake. I keep this video very simple, even though I actually try to keep nearly all my videos super simple. People conflate that I'm complicating things, and I'm never, ever trying to impress anybody by complicating anything. If you actually say a lot of things and you're trying to impress somebody with big words, which I'm never intentionally doing, then all you're doing is wasting your breath, meaning me. I've never, ever had that intention. By the way, in the community page, I recently wrote an article about the two selves and the spiritual polarization and the distinct parallels with lots of book and verse citations. I hope you like it. That's in the community page. I'm sorry for the past 2 weeks. I've been so incredibly busy, but I have been. Even right now while I'm making this video, I'm getting texts being sent to me by several different people trying to actually divide my attention between making this video. And I'm not going to read their texts. I would never do that during a video. Before actually making this video, it's something I've pointed out in live stream many times, and I mentioned it a couple times in video, that anything that has a beginning in time, or place, or both, can't be a universal truth. There are things that are hidden, due to the fact that you have to have a certain insight into how things work. See, people are texting me right now. That's one thing. In other words, it was always there, but a lot of people, due to the fact they're preoccupied with life, couldn't see it. That's one thing. I'm talking about this idea that before then everybody was doomed, but if something came along, that is conducive to your salvation, if you believe in it and follow in it, then that can't be a universal truth. I've never heard anybody mention this, ever, but I mean, it's an infallible, irreducible truth. It's kind of like the ground that you stand upon. You can't dig the foundation out from underneath your own feet. Metaphorically, it's completely impossible, and people do it all the time. But, well, before Guru Bada Bing came along, or before, this truth was established, well, truth is always inherently, timelessly, self-establishing. You could choose not to know it, and you could choose not to see it. And of course, a lot of truths cannot be seen objectively. They have to be known subjectively, but that's a matter for another discussion. Of course, the basis of all metaphysics, but it must be no beginning in place and no beginning in time, and it can't be centered around any particular guru or shaman, etc., etc. I'm going to talk about the fundamental foundation and keep this as simple as possible. And I think everybody could wrap their brain around this video. And if you actually understand it, just like a legend in a map, of course people don't read regular maps anymore. You actually had this little legend in the lower right-hand corner or somewhere at the bottom that said, well, these little marks mean train tracks, this means water, this means a legend. And the legend, or the primer, or the key to understanding cosmic physics and metaphysics is really simple. And it's absolutely written, the actual fabric or thread. By the way, the word sutta, which is usually translated as doctrine or teachings, literally means thread. It literally means the thread of truth that is woven throughout the fabric of everything, which is the absolute basement or foundation for everything that's true in the universe. So this foundational premise of a binary conjugate, I like to go down the list. And if you think about these, and you'd only really have to spend and half an hour or less truly comprehending this principle, and you'll see it absolutely everywhere. If you have your eyes open, a lot of people are just too preoccupied with paying the bills and, you know, keeping their wife or husband, entertained, and, you know, going to work and brushing your teeth, and, you know, some mundane things about modern life that keep modern humanity from understanding the things that ancient people ages ago were able to comprehend. Not that it was a widespread understanding back then. So I like to go down this binary conjugate and then put it all in a nutshell, which I'm actually already doing in this video. And it's incredibly important. I never, out of 8,600 some videos, almost never, maybe a dozen or so videos, maybe 20 at most out of 8,000 plus, say, you know, to understand this is absolutely necessary to understanding anything if you truly want to understand it. Let's go over a couple of them here. These two are actually the same. They are not conjugates or opposites or antinomies. That would be shadow and space. A space is absolutely no different than a shadow. Shadow is not a thing at all. A shadow, of course, is an absence of light. Now, the inverse of these two is light and ether or inertia. To say ether or inertia or subspace or zero-point energy, these are just different silly words that human beings, of course, have invented to refer to the ether, but shadow and space are not things. They're literally the negative image of pure potential, their true definition of energy. Humanity, unfortunately, suffers the delusion in that they see things of power, expressions of power. They think that itself is power, i.e. synonymous with pure potential, but it's not. It's the inversion of that. It's the impotency of saying. When you actually, let a firework go off, you see the really big fireworks go off, they create this enormous plume of force, and they're incredibly beautiful. Well, in the fireworks analogy, the thing that nobody cares about and is uninteresting to anybody is that, you know, charcoal gray powdered substance inside of a cardboard-like shell that contains all that energy and contains great potential, but no one cares about that. No one shows up at a fireworks show to look at these gigantic mortars of power. You know, they want to see them release their energy and actually fascinate humanity. And humanity, by its very nature, including all beings from one end of this universe to the next, are fascinated by expressions of power, but those expressions of power are impotency. And the after effect of those expressions is the creation of space. But space, as Nikola Tesla said, has absolutely no reality. He says it has no attributes also. You can't bend space and time. Time, of course, doesn't exist at all. It's a measure. Tesla said this as well. But human beings are fascinated by this. But shadows in space do not exist at all, and yet we have these concepts of shadows in space like unicorns and leprechauns, which of course also too don't exist. But these two antinomies, these conjugate pairs of light and inertia and space and shadows is the first set. And they're in no particular order here. In that same ilk, the opposite or inversion of the ether is the creation of space. And of course, creation of space is the after effect of a toroidal or divergent magnetic field. Of course, when you set a firework off, or the creation of space, in the case of a torus, would be the volume of this torus, which is space, but it is not a thing. Space is no different than a shadow. Space is literally the impotency or inversion of pure potential. Love and anger. Anger, of course, in cartoons and everything represented through countless eons has always been fire. They actually draw cartoons of people in anger with smoke billowing out of their ears or a fire above their head. It means it constantly has to be stoked. It has to be fed with that which is inherently ourself. We actually deplete ourselves in expressions of anger or hatred towards another, and this is perfectly natural, especially when people who want power, they trespass against us and they cause anger and other emotions of ourselves, but we end up destroying ourselves in an attempt to get even. Love, of course, is always rest. It is inertia. It is calm. Evil by definition, or hell by definition, a distinction without a difference. This is my quote, by the way. You can remember this because it's timeless and irrefutable. Hell itself, definitionally, is endless self-perturbation. The disturbance or perturbation of soul or spirit, nous chitta spiritus sanctum, a lot of different words in Latin, Greek, and Pali and Sanskrit means the exact same thing, and inversely so Rest means peace, equals transcendence. Bhav nirodha nabandham. Yoga chittavritti nirodha. Without translating these, I'll tell you in simple what they say in Sanskrit and Pali, and they are timeless and irrefutable, and they don't have a beginning, a place, and time, and they are timeless, and across the entire universe from one side to the other, means that the ending of disturbance or self-perturbation means transcendence. So we have this other conjugate pair, which is no different than saying ether or space, because force vector, as in the case of the magnetic field, with magnetism by definition, is the field of force, the creation of force. We have this binary conjugate of inertia, which is rest, and of force. But these are two things that are one and the same thing, but we have different expressions for one and the same thing. Well, they can't be the same. You just got done saying, you know, a shadow is an impotency of pure potential, i.e. the ether, and it is. And a shadow, of course, is created, and space is also, too, created by the force vector. But what this means is the transmutation, and this is genuine alchemy, not alchemy of changing one metal to another and other nonsense you think alchemy means, but true alchemy is the transmutation of pure potential into something else, which is also one and the same thing, like the transmutation of water into ice. You know, they're both the same thing, and of course ice is the cold state of water. It has totally different properties, but we know ice is water. At least anybody with 5 brain cells knows that. But it has completely different properties, just like the magnetic and the dielectric. Signal in the broadcast. Everybody thinks when you actually tune into a radio station, whatever that is, including NOAA Weather Radio,
the current time is 8.
The broadcast is not the signal. The signal is everywhere and nowhere. The capture of that, not that it's actually capturing it, but the harmonic for tuning that in by this antenna is interpretation of that signal by the analog digital converters, the speaker, on and on, a lot of different components that actually comes out of that speaker. This is the distinction between the signal and the broadcast, which are quite different. There's no signal in the radio. Obviously, there's no soul in the body, but that's not a denial of the soul, of course. So the signal and the broadcast, but one is an epiphenomena. I'm not trying to make a complicated word here, an epiphenomena. It basically means a consubstantial or a composite representation of the signal. A representation of a tree would be a master painter with his easel and paints, you know, painting the same tree. Say he's just the best painter on earth. He makes a perfect, you know, painted replica of the tree. It's not the tree, of course. It's an interpretation of the tree through another means, the oil, the canvas, the great skill and intellect of the painter, for example. The one fundamental conjugate binary of the entire universe, if people could wrap their brain around it, is 2, which are the same thing. Light and illumination. Of course, illumination is a frequency measured in cycles per second, i.e. wavelength, of light, and it is, of course, its phenomenon. I'm taking this piece of wire and I'm bending it around my finger here as a demonstration. Same distinction between, unfortunately, what is translated as wisdom, whether that be Greek or Pali or Sanskrit, which would be gnosis or vidya, which also, too, means light. The same word for wisdom, which is the same word for light, vidya, gnosis, or vidya in Sanskrit, i.e. light. The inverse of that, all you do is take an a prefixual before it, both in Greek and Sanskrit and Pali, and go avidya, agnosis. Well, this means ignorance. Well, when you say ignorance to anybody that understands English, they think you're talking about the ignorance of a person. Bob, Sue, or Larry is ignorant. No, that's something different. Don't confuse empirical knowledge, i.e. episteme, with gnosis or wisdom, or the absence thereof, which would be avidya or agnosis. In the case of emanationistic metaphysics, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian, agnosis has nothing to do, almost nothing to do with the person. It is pre-embodiment. In other words, the agnosis existed over here before the person was alive, before they were born. In other words, it is a condition of that light, or in this case the vidya or the soul or the gnosis thereof, because wisdom and the self are one and the same thing. It's the self that seeks itself, and of course self-proximity is wisdom. You know, you can't purify gold, but we talk about gold purity like 10 karat or 14 karat or 22 karat or 24 karat. So when we actually say purity, we're talking about self-similarity, because 14 karat, for example, is 56% gold content. That means 44% of the stuff in 14 karat is not gold. Silver or copper, depends on who amalgamated it. This means self-proximity, or gnosis, or wisdom, i.e. the soul itself, is greater and greater self-similarity. Anything that is greater and greater self-similar means it does not have in itself of itself modulation. I've taken this straight copper wire and I wrapped it around my finger and I kind of stretch it out there. You can see high frequency. Over here you can see low frequency. If I actually stretch it out, you can see it further. Here we actually go from higher frequency to lower and lower frequency. Well, before this was just merely brass wire. But now I've actually given it a disturbance whereby which it creates shadow, creates phenomena. The frequency or the modulation, i.e. the wavelength of light, is that which we deem as manifestation. Manifestation is never of light, it is of epiphenomena. In other words, not that the analogy is perfect, if I were to take this wire and bend it out and remove modulation, instead of actually landing on something and manifesting, it just passes through everything. Wouldn't that be the definition, according to the Greeks, the Indians, the Egyptians, Advaita Vedanta, the Nikayas, on and on and on and on, the definition of transcendence? Something does not take upon itself attribution or animation of that phenomena. It would be the removal of modulation. The removal of modulation of light, which is illumination, and to say illumination is to say frequency, means transcendence. Now this is as simple as it gets. You could go through 1,000 books, the best that was ever written, and spend decades to learn something that simple, and it all really does, and I assure you with everything and every fiber of my being, that is what it all boils down to. All of it does. What's the distinction between light and illumination? Well, there is no difference. Well, there is. We could say there's no difference ultimately between ice and water because they're both water, but there is a difference. Ice usually doesn't pass through a spaghetti strainer. Water, however, does. Now you can let the ice melt and it'll pass through the spaghetti strainer, but that's taking the analogy too far. Spiritual polarization, I just wrote an article, it's in the community forum, talking about the two selves and spiritual polarization. As I've said before countless times, of an ignorant person, there is no spiritual polarization. They are mixed together perfectly. If you actually take oil and water and stick it into a blender, at high speed, there'll be one thing. You won't see two things. If you let it settle, you actually let the whirlpool, because you stick it in a blender, it'll create its little whirlpool. It'll start to separate, and it'll separate more and more and more and more. You're like, there's the oil and there's the water. Spiritual polarization, the two selves. The existential self, the animate self, which would be no different than the broadcast, versus the transcendent self, which has nothing to do with the broadcast side of this radio, has nothing to do with the radio, doesn't even have anything to do with the antenna, because the signal is nowhere in this radio. It is everywhere and nowhere, right? If the signal has greater and greater self-similarity, which would be like taking 14 karat gold and doing true alchemy, not the alchemy that you think you know, like turning lead into gold. No. True alchemy, metaphysical alchemy, would be rest, removal of modulation, right? Dielectric and magnetic. Well, dielectric would be water and magnetic would be ice, analogously. Dielectric would be the wire, and the magnetic would be the frequency, the modulation. All I have to do is put a modulation or a loop spin in this. Of course, it's not moving. It's not three-dimensional. Of course, light doesn't move either. People think sound is an emission or sound that moves, and it doesn't. Tesla said that, and he's correct. Light doesn't move. Light's not an emission. Light's a disturbance of a medium. Light nor sound has a speed. The speed is the rate of induction or hysteresis of the medium. However, that's a matter for another discussion. Anyway, the dielectric, the magnetic. Here we have the magnetic. If I actually take it and bend it in on itself like this, it's kind of hard to do, and I'm not going to let you spend the time to do it. I can create a nice little torus out of this. I can actually create, if I bend the two here, it should only take a couple seconds, and I kind of do this number. Kind of hard to do, especially in a matter of a few seconds. That's not it, but you can see on the cross-section there it's a torus. Dielectric and the magnetic are no different than talking about light and illumination. Transcendent self versus existential, objective self. Yeah? Isn't this stuff really simple? You have to go through over 1,000 books, and I don't mean garbage books, I mean good books. Waste decades of your life just to get it boiled down to this. There is a reason why in ancient days, and I've talked about this in live stream recently, when people, and any translation says the same thing, so-and-so, talking about illiterate people, they had no education. Of course, education is a hindrance really than a help. They were illiterate. They probably never read a book in their whole life. Yet these people were able to, and there are countless evidences of it, in a matter of a few weeks or less, come to full understanding as to the nature of the cosmos and the methodology of transcendence. Nature is really simple. Your head has been filled with so much garbage that you're hopelessly lost, just like most people are. But all of this stuff is really simple. I think there's some movie line that says, I forget which movie it is, says it took me 100 years to learn that it didn't take 100 years. Something like, it took me 100 years to find out it didn't take 100 years. In other words, I could learn all this if I just had something super simple. It's all boiled down to this succinct point. Modulation and rest. Modulation of what? Modulation is not a thing any more than space and a shadow is a thing. Modulation of one thing due to something else. Modulation of spirit or self, of agitation, just kind of like this fire, not that this is a real fire. Modulation of something, but what is the impetus that keeps driving the modulation? What's the impetus that keeps wanting you to throw firewood upon the fire? You know, it's endless. I get it, it's wintertime, you want to heap firewood on the stove, but it's endless. People show people their winter collection of wood just to get them through the winter, and it's like, wow, that must be 5 years worth of wood there in your wood shed. Like, no, that's just like 2 or 3 months worth of wood. Like, whoa, really? Yeah, it's constant, never ending. You never had a wood fire or wood stove. You know, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you do know what I'm talking about. It's like, that's a massive amount of wood. It's like, no, it's not. It goes away very, very quickly. Body and spirit. These are antinomies. Is magnetism the antinomy of the dielectric? There's no branch of science that ever has stated to you what I have stated simply. Magnetism is the dielectric field. Magnetism is the extrinsic, attributional, or external, modulated dielectric field. It's the conjugate geometry, and they're inverse geometries of one another. Geometry of magnetism is a torus. The geometry of the dielectric is a hyperboloid. Hyperboloid, by the way, is this hourglass shape right here. Inverse of a hyperboloid is a torus. Body and spirit, antinomies. However, you can take body and spirit, bring them into pairing. A third thing which is necessary, and this is the secret mentioned in Plato's Timaeus, which is far, far more ancient than Timaeus, requires the third thing, that being water, of course. So body and spirit. You combine those two, of course, you have water. Light and illumination, vidya and avidya. The one and the one, the first two digits of the Fibonacci sequence are 1 and 1. They're not two different ones, they're the same one, principle and attribute. Self and self, light and illumination, dielectric and magnetic. Shadow or space, both are the same, versus light and ether, or light and inertia. Love and anger, force and inertia, signal and broadcast. The two selves. Spiritual polarization always culminates into this. Your average foolish person, there is no internal struggle. They're happy with who and what they are. They're mixed up like oil and water under, you ever stuck oil and water underneath, like in a blender? Mix it up, it'll be one thing. It has to rest, and the oil will separate from the water. Then there's polarization. The divine versus Mara, or Satan, which just means adversary. And one's adversary is the extrinsic self, the psychophysical self. Spiritual polarization, where there was merely a one in ignorance, talking about the common foolish person, now there are two. And now that there are two, they are at odds. I just wrote an article about that in the community page with tons of citations. As Plotinus said, ignorance is the cause, and there is no cause in emanationism. Uncaused cause, actually. For the soul's descent is deemed thulma, which is an untranslatable word from the Koine Greek. This is in Plotinus's Enneads 5.1.1. This is the reason behind the soul's necessity, and it doesn't mean necessity. The Greek word is anake. It literally means can't exist any other way. In other words, it's just the way it is. Kind of like principle and attribute, light and illumination, magnetic and dielectric. Also, too, of embodiment. Saying avidya is no different than saying illumination. Saying avidya does not mean ignorance. It means modulation. Modulation of spirit before embodiment. You know, there is not embodiment without avidya. Huh? If you don't understand that, you don't understand anything. Say the brass wire is the soul. The modulation thereof, with a set frequency, is the impetus for embodiment. Extrinsic attribute, light and illumination. If you can understand this simple primer, you can understand most things in this universe, and I do mean that literally. Anyway, I hope you like these videos. If you ever want to contact me, my information in the description below. Look at the community page for the download of that free 5-page article that I wrote. It's kind of a heavy article, but if you read it slowly, you'll be able to grasp all of it. Any donations always warmly welcome. Thank you so much for watching. Lux e Veritas. The lava lamp.